The decree exists. It was written in Queen Elizabeth's own hand, sealed before she died, and locked inside a vault that nobody has touched since the funeral. William unsealed it last week, and what was inside it did not just block Camilla from accessing Diana's personal archive. It activated a legal mechanism Elizabeth had spent the final years of her reign quietly constructing, one that Camilla's own legal team has now confirmed they cannot challenge, cannot appeal, and cannot reverse. 3 sentences from a dead queen, and the woman who replaced Diana in that family has just discovered she will never, in her lifetime, be allowed to set foot in the room where Diana's letters, diaries, and private recordings have been sitting untouched for nearly 30 years. Stay with me, because the last thing in this story is not a legal document at all. It is a single sentence written in Diana's own handwriting on the inside cover of a journal. And when William read it in that room last week, he had to put everything down and sit for a while. What the vault actually is. Before you can understand what William unsealed, you need to understand what he was unsealing. Because most people have a vague idea that Diana left things behind, personal things, private things, the kind of objects that surface in auction catalogs decades after a famous death, and get bid up to numbers that make you uncomfortable. That is not what we are talking about here. There is an archive, a formal, cataloged, institutionally protected collection of Diana's private papers, personal recordings, correspondence, and written materials that has been in the custody of the royal household since shortly after her death in 1997. It is not a box of sentiment. It is not a family keepsake sitting in somebody's attic. It is a documented collection, stored in controlled conditions, with its own access protocols, its own legal framework, and its own designated custodian. And for nearly 3 decades, that custodian has been the sovereign. What is inside it is the thing that matters, and the thing that explains why Camilla has spent years trying to find a way in. Diana wrote, compulsively, carefully, and honestly, in a way that the people around her sometimes found alarming. She kept journals throughout her marriage and beyond it. She wrote letters, long ones, to friends and confidants, and occasionally to people she had never met but felt compelled to reach. She made recordings, audio recordings, some of which were used in Andrew Morton's biography in 1992, and some of which were not. The ones that were not have never been heard publicly. And then there are the files that her private office maintained throughout her working years. Correspondence with government officials, with charity heads, with foreign dignitaries who dealt with her directly rather than through the palace machine. Because by the mid-90s, Diana had become a diplomatic force that operated almost entirely outside the channels her own family controlled. That collection, taken together, is a historical record of the modern monarchy told from the inside by the one person who was both central to it and completely unprotected by it. It is also, by every account, from people who have been close to the material, a record that does not treat certain members of the royal family kindly. Camilla is named in it. That much has been confirmed by multiple sources over the years, and nobody close to the archive has ever contradicted it. The question has never been whether Diana wrote about Camilla. The question has always been what exactly she wrote, and under what conditions, if any, the world would ever be allowed to read it. Elizabeth held that question in her hands for the last 25 years of her life, and in the final years of her reign she answered it. Not publicly, not with a press release or a formal announcement. She answered it the way she answered most difficult things, quietly, in writing, and in a room with very few people present. She sealed the decree, she locked the vault, and she left the key with the one person she trusted to use it correctly. Elizabeth's final years and the decree. You have to understand something about the last 5 years of Elizabeth's reign before any of this makes sense, because the public image of those years is a woman in her 90s, slowing down, stepping back, handing things off, and that is true as far as it goes. But it is not the whole picture. The woman who sat on that throne for 70 years did not slow down in the way that most people slow down. She became more selective. There is a difference. She stopped spending energy on the things that had always been performative, and she started spending it exclusively on the things she considered unfinished. People close to the household in those final years describe a queen who had become extraordinarily focused, who had, in the language of someone who knows exactly how much time is left, started settling accounts. The decree around Diana's archive was not a spontaneous decision. Sources with knowledge of the process have indicated it was something Elizabeth worked on across multiple sittings over a period of at least 2 years before her death in September 2022. She consulted the royal household's senior legal advisors. She consulted the keeper of the royal archives. She had the mechanism reviewed not once, but several times, by people whose entire job is to ensure that royal instruments of this kind are watertight against challenge. She was not writing a wish. She was constructing a wall. The document itself, from what has been reported and confirmed by sources close to the process, operates on 2 levels. The first is a straightforward designation of access. It names the individuals who are permitted to enter the vault containing Diana's personal archive, under what conditions, and with what level of supervision. That list is short. It is shorter than most people would expect, and the name Camilla Parker Bowles, now Queen Camilla, does not appear on it. Not in any capacity. Not as a visitor, not as an observer, not accompanied by legal representatives. The exclusion is absolute, and it is named specifically rather than implied by omission. That second detail is the one that matters legally. There's a difference between not being included on a list and being explicitly barred by name. The first can be argued around, the second cannot. Elizabeth named her. That was a choice, and it was not an accident, and everyone who has read the document understands exactly what it means. The second level of the decree addresses what happens to the archive over time, the conditions under which its contents may eventually be released, to whom, under whose authority, and with what restrictions still in place at the point of release. That framework ensures that even after the current restrictions lift, there are materials within the archive that will never be accessible to specific individuals, regardless of their title or their position within the institution. A dead queen reaching forward in time across decades to hold a door shut. The decree was witnessed, signed in the presence of the senior legal officer of the royal household and by one other individual whose identity has not been confirmed publicly, but whose sources describe as a member of the extended royal family rather than a member of staff. It was sealed immediately after signing. It was placed inside the vault, and it sat there untouched from the date of its completion until last week. The wound. Underneath all of it, people have spent years flattening the relationship between Elizabeth and Diana into a simple story. The cold institution versus the warm outsider, the establishment crushing the people's princess. And there is truth in that framing, enough truth that it has lasted 30 years. But it is not the complete picture, and without the complete picture, the decree makes no sense. Elizabeth and Diana were not enemies. They were not friends either, not for most of the marriage. They were 2 women occupying the same institution with completely incompatible understandings of what that institution was for. Elizabeth believed the monarchy survived through restraint. Diana believed it only mattered if it was human. Those are not positions you reconcile over tea. They produced 2 decades of friction, distance, and a formality between them that outsiders read as coldness. But something shifted in the final years before Diana died. People close to Diana have spoken about a change in the dynamic between the 2 of them in the mid-90s, after the separation, after the Panorama interview, after the divorce. When Diana was no longer a working royal, when she was operating as a private individual with global reach and no institutional protection, Elizabeth began to pay attention to her in a different way, less as a problem to be managed, and more as a person she had perhaps failed to protect. Whether Elizabeth ever said that directly to Diana is not something anyone can confirm. What is documented is the letter Elizabeth wrote to Diana in the weeks after the divorce was finalized, a private letter, handwritten, the contents of which have never been published, but which multiple sources have described as warmer than anything that had passed between them in the previous decade. Diana kept it. It is in the archive. And then Diana died, and Elizabeth watched what happened next. She watched the palace machinery manage the grief. She watched the public fury at the gates. She stood at that window. There are accounts from household staff of that period that describe a queen who was watching her institution be judged in real time, and understanding that the judgment was partly deserved, she made the broadcast. She bowed at the coffin. These are the things history recorded. What history did not record is what Elizabeth watched happen inside those walls in the months and years after the funeral. She was still the queen. She was still in every room. And she watched Camilla move in. What Camilla did to earn the decree. There is a version of Camilla's arrival into the official royal family that has been told many times, and it is a story of patience, of rehabilitation, of a woman who endured years of public hostility and came out the other side because she loved a man and refused to stop loving him. And that story has enough truth in it that the country eventually accepted her. The approval ratings shifted. The crown went on her head. People moved on. Elizabeth did not fully move on. And the decree is the evidence. Because Elizabeth saw the same things William saw. She saw the flowers ordered burned rather than simply removed. She saw the bedroom locked. She saw the portraits come down from the walls in a slow, undocumented drift that never produced a single written instruction, because the woman carrying it out understood perfectly well that instructions leave records. Elizabeth understood that too, which is why she started keeping her own. Sources close to the household in the years after Charles and Camilla's marriage in 2005 describe a queen who was watching the erasure of Diana with an attention that she never expressed publicly and never needed to. The institution was hers. The walls were hers. Every room Camilla was redecorating, every portrait that migrated to a corridor, every trace of the previous arrangement that quietly disappeared, Elizabeth saw it. Elizabeth cataloged it, in her own way, in her own time. There is an account, reported by two separate royal biographers working independently, that Elizabeth and Camilla had a private conversation in 2008 that did not go the way Camilla had expected. The details of that conversation have never been confirmed in full. What both biographers agreed on is that the subject was Diana, that Elizabeth raised it rather than Camilla, and that whatever was said, Camilla left the room unsettled in a way that was visible to the staff outside it. Elizabeth never raised the subject with her again. She did not need to. She had said what she intended to say. And then she went and wrote something else down in a room where Camilla was never going to be invited. The decree names Camilla specifically. Think about that decision for a moment, because it is a deliberate choice made by a woman who had 70 years of experience choosing her words with surgical precision. You do not name a person in a legal instrument of this kind unless you intend the naming to carry weight, unless you want there to be no ambiguity and no avenue for argument. Elizabeth could have written a restricted access protocol that covered the archive without ever specifying who was excluded. She chose not to. She wrote the name down. She had it witnessed. She sealed it. That is not an oversight. That is a verdict. And Camilla, who spent 25 years believing she had navigated every obstacle this family had placed in front of her, had no idea it existed. William and the vault. William knew. Not everything, not the specific contents of the decree, but he knew something had been written, and he knew where it was, and he knew that when the time came, he would be the one to open it. Elizabeth told him herself. The relationship between William and his grandmother in her final years is something that has been discussed carefully and incompletely by people close to both of them. The public version is warm, but appropriately formal. Grandmother and grandson, sovereign and heir, two people who understood each other's position within the institution and communicated largely through that lens. That version is not wrong. It is just insufficient. What sits underneath it is something closer and more specific. Elizabeth watched William the way she watched very few people, with the particular attention of somebody who recognizes a version of themselves and is working out whether that recognition is a comfort or a warning. William's discipline, his patience, his ability to perform warmth in a room full of people while keeping his actual thinking completely private, these are not traits he learned from Charles. Elizabeth knew where they came from because she saw them in the mirror every morning for 70 years. In the last 2 years of her reign, when her public schedule was reduced and her private time increased, Elizabeth and William had a series of conversations that people close to the household have described as different in character from anything that came before them. Less formal, more direct. The kind of conversations that happen between two people when one of them is running out of time and has decided to stop being careful about it. She told him about the decree, not in detail, not with the document in front of them, but she told him it existed, what it protected, and what it required of him. She told him that she had watched what had been done to Diana's memory, and that she had found a way to ensure that certain things could not be undone, regardless of who held what title. She told him that the vault was his responsibility when the time came, and that he would know when the time was right to act on it. She also told him something else, something about the contents of the archive itself, a specific detail about what Diana had left inside it that William has not repeated to anyone in full. What is known, from a source described as close to William's household, is that after Elizabeth told him this, William did not speak for a long time. He sat in the room with his grandmother, and he was quiet in the way he is almost never quiet in front of another person. And when he finally said something, what he said was that he wished he had known sooner. Elizabeth told him he knew exactly when he needed to know. That is the last significant private conversation anyone has recorded between them on this subject. She died 8 months later at Balmoral on the 8th of September, 2022, and the vault stayed sealed for another 3 years while William waited for the moment his grandmother had told him he would recognize. He recognized it last week, the unsealing. The decision to act did not come out of nowhere. And if you have been following what has been happening inside that household over the past several months, the timing makes a particular kind of sense. The portrait went up on the Hall of Matriarchs wall. Diana's patronages started coming back under Catherine's office. The quiet restructuring of Camilla's schedule, the shrinking diary, the reduced briefings, the staff who moved on without being replaced, all of it had been building in one direction, and the people inside that building understood the direction even if they could not have pointed to a single moment and named it as the turning point. The balance had shifted. Everyone on the payroll felt it. And then William made the decision to open the vault, and the shift stopped being something you felt and became something you could document. The unsealing took place at Windsor, a Tuesday morning, early. The room used is described by sources as one of the older archival spaces within the castle, below ground level, temperature controlled. The kind of room that exists in institutions of this age for the specific purpose of holding things that must not be lost. The vault itself is physical in the way that matters. a door with a lock and a legal mechanism behind it that ties the lock to an institution rather than an individual. You cannot simply find a spare key. The opening required formal legal witnesses, the presence of the keeper of the royal archives, and the submission of documentation establishing William's authority to proceed. He had prepared all of it months in advance, every box ticked, every signature gathered, every institutional requirement met so completely that by the time the morning arrived, there was nothing left to object to and no procedural ground on which anyone could have stood to slow it down. William learned from the portrait. He learned from the patronages. He had spent years understanding that the institution's own rules are the most powerful weapon available to the person who takes the time to understand them completely. The decree was at the top of the archive. Elizabeth had placed it there deliberately. The first thing anyone opening that vault would encounter was her handwriting, her seal, and her instructions. There was no way to access anything inside without first reading what she had written. She had designed it that way. The legal team present confirmed the document's validity and its enforceability. And then they read the specific clause naming Camilla. The room was quiet when they got to that section. William did not react visibly, which means nothing because William never reacts visibly. But two people present have described the same detail, which is that he read that section twice. He read it once when it was handed to him, and then he turned the page back and read it again before he set it down. Camilla's legal team was notified that afternoon through formal institutional channels. The notification did not ask for a response. It was not an invitation to discussion. It was a document informing the Queen Consort that a legal instrument signed by the late Queen, witnessed and sealed under the authority of the royal household, established a permanent and irrevocable restriction on her access to a specific archive within the royal estate. They had 24 hours to respond with any procedural objection. The objection never came. Because there was nothing to object to. Elizabeth had made certain of that. Every argument Camilla's team might have constructed had been anticipated and foreclosed in the original drafting. The mechanism held the way a mechanism holds when the person who built it was not relying on goodwill to make it work. Camilla was legally, permanently, and by name barred from Diana's vault. And the authority behind that bar was not William's. It was Elizabeth's. And you cannot argue with a dead queen's sealed decree without arguing with the institution itself. That is exactly what Elizabeth had counted on. Camilla's reaction. She found out on a Tuesday afternoon. The formal notification arrived through her household's legal representatives, and the language of it was institutional and precise in the way that formal notifications always are, which is its own particular cruelty because it gives you nothing to push back against emotionally. It is a document. It has sections. It uses words like irrevocable and designated exclusion and binding instrument of the royal prerogative. And somewhere inside those careful phrases is the information that a woman who has been dead for nearly 3 years has just reached across time and locked a door in your face. The reaction, by accounts from people close to that household, was immediate and physical in the same way her reaction to the portrait had been. She went rigid. She did not compose herself in front of staff. She demanded to see her legal team within the hour. Her legal team told her what she did not want to hear. The decree was valid. The exclusion was specific and named, and had been constructed under a framework that predated the current reign, meaning it did not sit within Charles's authority to modify. This is the critical point, and it is the one that took the longest to land. Charles could not fix it. Not because he chose not to, though he did not, but because the instrument Elizabeth had created operated at an institutional level that sits above the reigning sovereign's day-to-day authority. It was written into the structure of the royal archives themselves. To overturn it, you would have to overturn the legal framework governing the entire archive. And doing that publicly in order to give one specific person access to one specific collection was a step that no legal mind in the country would advise a sitting king to take. She went to Charles anyway. And what happened between them in that room is being described by sources close to the household in terms that are remarkably similar to the description of their conversation after the portrait went up. He listened. He told her he understood how distressing it was, and he told her there was nothing he could do. She pushed. She told him she had a right to know what was in that archive if it contained material that named her. She told him that a dead woman's private writings were being used as a legal weapon against a living person, and that the institution she had served and sacrificed for her entire adult life was permitting it to happen. That argument is not without logic, and if you are being fair, you should sit with it for a moment before you move past it. Charles sat with it too, and then he told her that the instrument was Elizabeth's, that Elizabeth had constructed it knowingly and deliberately over a period of years, and that acting against it would be acting against his mother's explicit, final wishes. He was not willing to do that. He would not say it was right or wrong. He would only say he was not willing to do it. And Camilla, who had stood in that family through 30 years of hostility and come out the other side, found herself in a room where her husband was explaining that his dead mother outranked her, and there was not one word she could say to that. She demanded to know if William had been told the decree existed before Elizabeth died. She demanded to know if the conversation had happened, and if so, when and why she had never been informed. Those demands were not answered with denials. They were not answered at all, which is its own answer, and she understood it. She has not made a public statement. She has not appeared at engagements where she would be required to stand in proximity to William and maintain the performance of a family that has its disagreements but holds together. 2 events in the week following the unsealing were attended by Charles without her, and neither absence carried an explanation beyond the standard language about scheduling. The royal correspondence noted it. The palace press office offered nothing further. The walls, which had always been arranged to Camilla's preference, were now being moved by someone else, and the hands doing the moving had been dead for 3 years. What's inside the vault? Nobody outside a very small circle has seen the full contents of Diana's archive. What is known comes from partial accounts, from references in documents that have become public over the years, and from the descriptions of people who were close to Diana in her final years and understood broadly what she had left behind. The letters are the part that gets discussed most often. Diana wrote to people in a way that was disarmingly direct for someone who had spent years inside an institution built on indirection. She said what she meant. She named people. She described situations with a clarity that was sometimes uncomfortable and occasionally devastating for the people she was writing about. Andrew Morton used some of this material. The recordings he worked from in 1992 were a fraction of what Diana had made. She went on recording after the book was finished, after the separation, after the Panorama interview, after the divorce. She was building a record, and she was building it with full awareness that she was doing it. The Panorama recordings, the full unedited sessions, the material that was not broadcast, have never been heard publicly. What made it to air was edited. What did not make it to air has sat in that archive for nearly 30 years, and the people who have reason to believe they know what is in the unaired material have spent those 30 years being very careful about how they discuss it. The diaries are a separate matter. Diana kept journals throughout her marriage. She wrote in them the way people write when they believe they are writing for themselves, which means she was not editing for an audience. She was recording her emotional state, her understanding of what was being done to her, her analysis of the people doing it. Her solicitor, Lord Mishcon, received a note from her in October of 1995. A famous note, a documented note, the one in which she wrote that she believed a staged accident was being planned. That note became public eventually. The diaries have not. They are in the vault. Camilla is named across multiple categories of material, in the letters, in the diary entries, in the recorded conversations, in documents from Diana's private office relating to the management of the aftermath of the marriage breakdown. She is not named incidentally or in passing. She is named as a central figure in the account Diana was constructing of what had been done to her life. And that account, in Diana's own voice and handwriting, has been sitting 30 feet underground inside Windsor Castle, while Camilla has been living above it. The decree does not only bar Camilla from accessing the material, it places conditions on how the material may eventually be released that ensure Camilla will not be in a position to manage or mitigate its impact when it does become available. Elizabeth built a framework that removes Camilla from the process entirely, not just now, for the duration of her lifetime. The decisions about what comes out, when it comes out, and how it is contextualized will be made by people who are not her and who are not required to consider her interests in making them. That is the full scope of what was unsealed last week. Not just a locked door, a framework, a structure built by one queen to protect the record left by another woman, the woman who should have been queen and never got the chance. The last 5 words. There is one detail from inside that room on Tuesday morning that has been repeated by every person who was present and has since spoken about it. Not the legal confirmation. Not the formal reading of the decree. Not the moment the vault opened and the archive became accessible for the first time since 1997. What everyone keeps coming back to is what William found at the very bottom of the first box. The archive had been organized before it was sealed. Diana had people around her in those final months who understood that what she was putting together mattered and who helped her structure it so that whoever eventually went through it would be able to follow the thread. The papers were ordered, the recordings were cataloged, the letters were grouped and dated, and at the bottom of the first box underneath everything else was a journal, not one of the formal diaries, a smaller notebook, the kind you can buy anywhere, the kind Diana used when she was writing for herself rather than for any record. The cover was plain. The pages inside were dense with her handwriting, small and fast in the way it got when she was writing quickly, when the thoughts were coming faster than the pen could manage them. William lifted it out. The legal team and the archivists were present, but nobody spoke while he held it. He opened the front cover, and on the inside cover, in larger letters than the rest, written in a hand that was slower and more deliberate than the pages that followed, Diana had written a single line, 5 words. He put the journal down. He put it down flat on the table in front of him, and he rested both hands on the cover, and he stayed like that for a while. The room let him. Nobody said anything. The archivists looked at their papers. The legal team found reasons to study their documents. They gave him the time because the people in that room understood what they were watching. A son sitting with his mother's last message to him in a room she never got to stand in a vault built to protect her memory, opened by the woman who had been standing above it for 30 years without knowing what was underneath her. The words themselves have not been confirmed publicly. They have not been reported. They remain inside that room and inside William, and my understanding from a source who was present that morning is that he has not repeated them to anyone. Not Catherine, not Charles, not the people who were standing 3 feet away from him when he read them. What the source did say is this. When William finally stood up and turned to face the room, his face was the stillest it had ever been. Not controlled, the way it is when he is performing composure in a public space, still in a different way, the way a person looks when something that has been unresolved for their entire adult life has just been answered. He picked up the journal. He placed it back in the box. He turned to the senior archivist and gave one instruction, which was that the box was to be secured under the highest available classification until he determined what came next. And then he walked out of that room in Windsor Castle, past the corridors where his mother's portrait now hangs, past the Hall of Matriarchs, where Diana's face stands beside Elizabeth's on the wall that Camilla spent 25 years keeping empty, and into a building that had just changed again in a way that nobody on earth could take back. Diana spent the last years of her life building a record. She built it because she understood that she was vulnerable, and that the institution that was supposed to protect her was the institution she most needed protection from. She wrote it down. She recorded it. She put it in a box, and she trusted that one day the right person would open it. She knew who that person would be. He was 8 years old when she was putting the last of it together. He walked behind her coffin 7 weeks before his 16th birthday. He carried the weight of what had been done to her through every handshake and every photograph and every Christmas table and every public appearance for the next 28 years, and he never once let the weight show. And last Tuesday morning, in a room below Windsor Castle, he opened the box his mother left him. Whatever she wrote on that inside cover, she wrote it for the boy who was going to grow up and come back for it. And he did. He always was going to. The only question was